Good morning. We're going to go ahead and get started.
Those two and then staff.
And the commissioners, particularly, and then you have the
Let's see.
board.
Let's see. Is this one working?
Yeah, and then you have the
Yeah,
commissioners.
I do that.
Not sure if that is. Christian, do you know if? He's got it. All right, all. Can everybody hear me? Good morning. Can everyone?
You have to use your church voice.
I know.
Your outside voice.
May not have much of a church voice. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Welcome. My name is Thomas Reed. For all of you who haven't met me, I see many familiar faces, but welcome this morning. I am the director of the FCC's Office of Communications Business Opportunities. And we're here this morning and today to discuss USC Annenberg's draft report on the critical information needs of the American public, as well as their discussion of the market entry barriers to participation in the media and telecommunications industries. Our agency, the FCC, commissioned this study in order to begin to identify market entry barriers and assess whether such barriers impact the public's critical information needs. This report informs the Commission's obligation under Section 257 of the Telecom Act to every 3 years report to Congress on the market entry barriers in the media and communications industries. We've essentially asked USC Annenberg, to answer 3 questions for us through sort of an exhaustive look at the literature and research in these fields. And the 3 questions we've asked them to look at are, how do Americans meet their critical information needs? How does the media ecosystem operate to address critical information needs? What barriers exist to providing content and services to address critical information needs? So we have a very august panel here this morning. And I think the way we're going to do this is somewhat informally. We're going to have the Coalition of Scholars from Annenberg present a summary of the report. And that's to my left, Dean Ernest Wilson and Dr. Corolla Weil and Catherine Anyanova. Did I get that right? All right. And Dr. Phil Napoli and Lou Friedland. So they're going to report, give you a summary of their findings on the critical information needs of the American public. And then we're going to hear a response to the report, an initial response to the report, by Dr. Young-Jun Park of Howard University, Dr. Jonathan Ladd from Georgetown, and Dr. James Hamilton from Duke. So we're going to go through that part of the exercise. They'll have a discussion about Annenberg's findings. And I think hopefully thereafter we'll have about 45 minutes to an hour for Q&A. We're also hoping to have Commissioner Clyburn join us. So whenever she joins us, we will interrupt the proceedings and have her address us. So with that, I'd like to welcome you all, and I'm looking forward to a lively discussion. Dr. Wilson?
Good. Thank you very much, Mr. Reed. And I want to thank the Commission for supporting this initial review of the literature review, looking at critical information needs of the American public and possible market barriers that might impact them adversely. I would especially like to thank the Chairman Janikowski, for his support, and as Mr. Reed just mentioned, also the special efforts and interest of Commissioner Clyburn, who has been very helpful in helping us to think about this. And of course, I want to thank the gentleman to my right, who has been a leader and helping us to think through these issues and to recognize the importance, as well as Jonathan Levy, who has been working with us in Washington and in California to think about this important issue, and other members of the staff as well. Personally, I came to this project with a long-standing interest in the issues of diversity, especially in public media, and the role that academics and researchers can play in informing the policy process. This particular undertaking began several years ago when the Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism at the University of Southern California began to convene several workshops to try to address the issue of how shall we define diversity in a new way when the conditions have changed so radically. So we held a series of discussions here in Washington, and we were fortunate enough to engage with some very good scholars in this area. Several of them are on this panel today. And we created what we call the Communication Policy Research Network. The Communication Policy Research Network, which by this time has more than 30 members all across the country. We had at the same time expert authors and contributors. I don't know if we have. Yes, we do. So these are some of our expert authors and contributors who made material contributions to this study and to this report. I especially want to point to the great work done by my co-principal investigators, Lou Friedland of the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and Phil Napoli of Fordham University. Our lead research assistant, Katya Onyagova, you did a better job of that than I, who did a heck of a job putting together a modest, I say that sarcastically, annotated critical bibliography of 840 entries, which I do really recommend that you also take a look at. And my colleague Sandra Ball-Rakich at USC in the Metamorphosis Project. I would also like to thank Dr. Carola Weil to my immediate left, who really coordinated this entire effort. And I would note also that the Commission has asked for this work under the authority of Section 257 to discuss the needs to identify barriers to market entry and propose ways to eliminate those barriers. This has been, I have to say, for all of us, a lot of labor going into it in a fairly short amount of time. All this was put together in a couple of months, I think, gentlemen and ladies. It really was a labor of love because everyone on this panel deeply believes in the importance of this topic, and we're really delighted that we had the opportunity to work with our colleagues at the FCC who are also so committed to this topic. Let me just say from the very beginning, I want to kind of give the punchline, the headline for you, for those in the room. And it goes something like this, that we're looking at sort of three big important things. On the one hand, we know that the media environment is changing radically. It's being turned upside down, tectonic change, creative destruction, etc. So the media environment is changing radically. At the same time, the demographics of the United States of America are also changing very radically, much more differentiated along a number of different lines. And so in some ways the question we are asking is, how do these two things mutually affect one another, especially in terms of the communication needs of communities? What are the information needs of communities, which themselves are changing, and the technologies are changing, and the relationship among them, the relationships are changing. So it was our task to try to go through the literature and to identify what the trends are in the literature. I do want to underscore this fact. This is a literature review, a critical literature review. Our mandate was not to propose a new set of policies. It was to look analytically as scholars. There were moments when we said, what the FCC really should do is A, B, and C. But that's not our mandate. Our mandate is to produce a scholarly research effort, and I think that we have achieved that with some success. Let me just close by mentioning a few facts that my other colleagues I know will address also, is that we're not simply looking at old media and new media in siloed arrangements, but how do these media interact with one another in a media ecology? We also want to recognize in the report that traditional concepts of majority and minority also do not fully capture how Americans use different forms of media to fill their critical information needs. Last but not least, we recognize that the courts and Congress have mandated that the Commission must be able to demonstrate a compelling rationale for its proposed regulations. And we have been asked to help the Commission to do this by, one, identifying critical information needs of communities, and secondly, how those critical information needs are met in the current media ecosystem or environment, and then what kinds of barriers might exist to block or prohibit citizens from having their information needs adequately met in this new kind of environment. And I also want to underscore the sense of urgency. I think that came through very much in our study, that this is an issue that needs to be addressed not only for regulatory and legislative issues, but the needs on the ground across the country are of some urgency. I would now like to turn the proceedings over to my colleagues to present our key findings. Lou, why don't I turn it over to you? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Ernie. As Ernie said, we did have 2 years. This, in some ways, it was a 2-month sprint to write the report, but it was growing out of 2 years of discussion among the members of the Communications Policy Research Network, and we thank them. When we began the report, our first task, or our mandate, frankly, as we read it, was to examine the literature across the social sciences and even beyond, if necessary, to try to uncover everything that we could locate that spoke to our broad definition of the critical information needs of U.S. communities. And I will get to that, what those needs are, in a moment. But we began with our own fields, in my case, communication and sociology, but we ranged across journalism, economics, political science, geography, urban studies, urban planning, library and information science, health, education, transportation, environmental science, and emergency and risk management. And we did that in 2 months, which was not easy. We basically, thanks I should say in no small part, I should say largely to Katya Ognjanova, who led the process. We established an initial database of about 1,000 peer-reviewed articles, roughly, that we then read and narrowed down to 485, or actually it grew eventually to 800 some, so it was a large, but 485 annotated entries examining those critical information needs, media ecologies, the media ecologies that serve them, barriers to participation, and a range of available methodologies and measures. And here I would also like to thank Sandra Kniesly and Matt Barnage of the University of Wisconsin, Madison, and Sumin Su of Columbia University, who also made major contributions to the development of that bibliography. So what are the critical information needs of Americans? How did we find them, and how did we define them? The first thing that I want to stress, as Ernie Dean Wilson said a moment ago, is that this is a moving target. We really are changing so rapidly as a nation that simply capturing those needs in a snapshot is not an easy thing to do. We had to begin with a policy-relevant understanding of what diversity meant in a changing United States, and broadly we used the following set of definitions. We looked at diversity of views in a changing America, which of course is always a complex mosaic. A diversity of sources in local markets, and this was a particular focus of ours. In other words, if there are a set of critical information needs as we define them, what are the sources by which those needs might be met in local communications markets and more broadly local communities? And I want to stress here, although this may seem fairly obvious, that we focused on the relationship between communities, needs, and communication. We saw those as analytically separable, but ultimately inseparable. People live in communities of place. They live in neighborhoods. They shop. Most of us still work in communities. We have to get to work by local transportation systems. We breathe the air in our local communities. Our children go to school in local communities, and so on. And so that was the foundation of our research, the fact and the range of needs that people had in local communities. Finally, our definition of diversity included the again by now fairly obvious fact that the United States demographically is changing at warp speed, and for us it was one central fact was the declaration by the U.S. Census Bureau that by approximately 2042, give or take, the United States there will no longer be a single majority group in the United States. We are rapidly becoming quite literally a nation of pluralities, not a nation of a majority and minorities. And we felt like that was essential to take into account in our understanding of diversity, not only in the present, but for the very near future of the United States. So what were the critical information needs of communities? We want to stress that we use two broad frameworks to determine those needs. First of all, we asked ourselves, what do individuals and communities need to survive? So what are the very basic needs that individuals in any community in the United States, rural, medium, urban, large metropolitan, regardless of size, what are the needs that any individuals need simply to survive, to navigate through their daily life in those communities? And secondly, what do they need to thrive in those communities in a sustainable manner? So what are the basic needs that everyone has, and what are the needs that we have to build a thriving, flourishing United States in this diverse nation that we are headed towards? To answer that question, we reviewed a core set of 8 basic information needs. We looked at emergency and public safety. This was clearly a bedrock need. Every citizen needs to know when their lives and the lives of their families are being threatened in a timely manner, and we stress, in a language that they can actually understand and in a medium that they can access. Simply having over-the-air broadcast in English of a tornado on its way is not sufficient if you don't understand English. And so there was a bedrock set of emergency and public safety needs that we articulated in the report that we believe that every American needs access to. Second was health and welfare. Obviously, we are in the midst of a great national health care debate, what our health care system should be like, how it should function. We, of course, were agnostic on what the outcome of that debate should be, but we did recognize that whether one advocates the most market-based solution or some other set of solutions, that every American at minimum needs to know where health care availabilities are in their local communities. Quite literally, if I need well baby care, how can I find a doctor? If my father is, and my aging father is sick, where can I take care of him? And this was underscored for us in a New York Times article just last week on the Oregon healthcare system, where they held a lottery for 10,000 essentially Medicaid slots. 90,000 people applied. Of course, only 10,000 received them, but this did give us a chance to understand what were the major differences for low-income people between those who have health care and those who don't. And one of the main things that people who had health care said had changed for them after they were admitted into this Medicaid lottery was that they said that in contrast to the uninsured, that they now could find information. They could not find information before. Many of the poor people, low-income people interviewed by the Times said they'd sought care from free clinics or charity hospitals, but they didn't know where they were. They couldn't find them. They didn't know when they were open. They didn't know which programs were available. They didn't know how to use them. They didn't know what paperwork to bring to them to prove that they were actually in poverty. They didn't know where to get child care when they went to the doctors. You might show up on the wrong day, they said. At this very, very basic level, of navigating the healthcare system, whether one's advocating for a market or a non-market solution, people did not have this core and basic information. Education. This is a long one, and we talk about it at length in the report. But here again, we want to just stress that every American parent needs to understand what the extent of the education system is in their local community, how is it functioning, what opportunities are available to their children. I'll give you one other example, and don't worry, I don't have too many examples. Achievement Preparatory Academy right here in Washington, D.C. It's one of the highest achievement college preparatory academies, public charter schools in D.C., and actually one of the highest in the United States. It won an EPIC Silver, a Community Silver Gain School, one of only 18 in the United States. It's in the Tier 1 here in D.C. in the charter school system. 82% of its children are proficient or advanced in math in their very first year, but it's under-enrolled by 40%. And that under-enrollment has risen a bit over the years to now where it's 25%, which means that even though it's the best charter school in the city, not enough parents actually know that it's the best charter school in the city to seek to have their children enrolled there. So that's another very basic example. If we want to have charter schools, choice schools, if we support that policy, then we need to at least have parents know what those schools are, where they are, and that that's an opportunity for their children. Transportation is a fairly obvious one, but people do need to, certainly to get to work, they need to know how to get to work, and we found that in many cases the most basic transportation information infrastructure was still lacking in cities. Some cities are quite advanced, where you can use a cell phone, for example, if you have a cell phone, to check when and where your bus is coming. But for many cities, you have to navigate complicated websites, or there may be no websites at all, just to use the transportation system. Economic opportunities. We found that there are basic needs simply in the creation of local job markets. With the disappearance of the local newspapers' classified section rapidly as a definitive source of jobs, while there are spot job markets appearing on the web in some places, there are not systematic job opportunities available on the web in local communities, and particularly for middle and lower income jobs. If you want to be an engineer, great, you can still go to monster.com. If you want to find out an entry-level secretarial job systematically, in many communities, there's no obvious place to go. Environment. What is the quality of air? What is the quality of water? How do I find that out if I'm a parent or a citizen? Is there a brownfield near my home? How do I find that out? It's not always obvious. In fact, we can say with some level of, I shouldn't say certainty, but we can say that we found no evidence to support that information is widely available to citizens in local communities. Civic life, we found some very important results here, particularly about the role that public libraries play. I should say the critical role that public libraries play in continuing to meet the critical information needs of their communities. This is the source for many people, lower income, minorities, people of different ethnicities and races, immigrants. This is the place where they get their critical information needs met, but libraries are, not surprisingly, overstretched in most communities using older equipment, lower speed broadband, and so even here where there is a stopgap, it's not being met in most places to the extent that it might. And finally, political information. We simply started with the bedrock insight that in a federal democracy, one that's rooted at the local level, which is the foundation of all policy in the United States, that one ought to be able to know, at minimum, who is actually running for local office, what offices they're running for, and we would hope also what the positions of diverse candidates are. And in many communities, when one goes down to the aldermanic level, much less school boards, local neighborhood councils, that information is still not available. It used to be provided in part by newspapers. More and more it's not being. Finally, communities are differentiated in many ways, and our largest challenge is to actually capture the ways that communities are differentiated in understanding how they meet their needs as a whole. They're shaped by diverse needs, as we've said, ethnicity as well, but as well occupation and income, gender and family situation, age is a very critical division right now in how people meet their critical information needs. There's a large gap, as most of us know, between millennials and seniors, and even many people in between. Health and ability is a major factor in determining needs. Religion is, in some cases, a very, very important factor, and civic participation. So in short, we found that there's a shortage of critical information needs being met in communities in key areas, the ones that I've discussed, but particularly in marginalized and low-income communities. But most importantly, and this is the major message of this report, despite the fact that we uncovered about 1,000 articles and included roughly 485 plus in our final review, the literature is frankly spotty across all these areas. The large message that we're here to deliver is that we really don't know how these needs are being met. There has not been systematic research in any of the multiple subfields that I began by telling you about. And it's important to be able to understand not only what those needs are and how they're being met, but how they're being met across all the levels of the local communication ecology. And now I'll pass the baton, as it were, to my colleague Phil Napoli.
Is this on? I'm good? Okay, good. I'm going to talk primarily about, where are we on this?
I already switched.
Oh, we're good? Okay. Thanks. Three of the sections of the report, those that deal with the issue of how do different media platforms and sectors deal and address the critical information needs of communities, the literature dealing with the relationship between minority and female ownership and the media outlets and participation in media outlets and the meeting of critical information needs. And then the third section is the barriers to participation in media content production and distribution, and how that might affect the meeting of various community critical information needs. So it was a wide-ranging, needless to say, body of literature that we were looking at. To start, and so what I'll try to do is summarize not only what emerged as some of the sort of most common findings amongst this literature, but also what appeared to be the most relevant gaps in this literature. So within those 2 points of focus, hopefully that can provide some useful foundation for thinking about future research in these areas that might be helpful to guide policy. Because I think that's one important thing to emphasize about a lot of this research that we uncovered in this review is that a large proportion of it isn't really motivated by or seeking to address communications policy issues, and in some cases that's a problem. That sometimes, as the nature of the questions that the Commission is addressing are changing, the nature of what is relevant policy research is changing as well. And so I think there's opportunities here for expanding the sort of boundaries of what we consider policy research, and for researchers across all these various fields that Lou was mentioning to really think more about specific policy issues that their research might be able to address. That's sort of a bit of an aside. But in any case, to summarize some of the key findings within these three areas. First, we saw a recurring pattern that research that has tried to examine how different media platforms address critical information needs continues to show us that there's a process in which much of the actual original information that is addressing critical information needs is continuing to be generated by predominantly traditional media outlets, those very media outlets who are having their long-established business models sort of decay underneath them. But that information then flows through and is augmented by and is supplemented by the wide array of new media platforms and services that are increasingly available. And the flows do often can be found to go in both directions. There are some instances in which we're seeing information flow from new media to traditional media. But understanding those patterns of how information flows through communities, what media platforms and services are serving as more as relay mechanisms, for example, or as alert systems for information produced elsewhere. Those interrelationships, we're only just beginning to see research that takes that sort of interaction into effect. More often, traditionally, and this was the bulk of the literature that we were finding in this area, is research that has focused on how does a particular media platform, say, for example, how do radio stations provide a certain kind of information, perhaps emergency information, or how do newspapers cover health information? It might even be health information about a particular health issue. How kind of newspaper coverage at the local level do we see about cancer information? And so we've aggregated all of that, those kinds of studies that are relevant, but each of them individually doesn't necessarily represent a particularly useful template to follow going forward for the kind of work that would really inform policymaking. So that's an important characteristic, I think, of this literature that we wanted to emphasize. We are also seeing that different media platforms, both from the standpoint of producers and consumers, are serving different functions. That is, there is really the days of a single platform media content provider are largely over, but we're starting to see how there's some literature that's starting to illustrate how, for example, newspapers will use Twitter or use Facebook in ways that augment or further enhance the distribution of the information that's being produced first and foremost for the traditional print outlet. But here again, these are recent enough phenomena that it's really probably not surprising that the bulk of the research that we've located up to this point has been much more focused on the performance of individual traditional media platforms. Moving to the issue of women in marginalized groups and content production and distribution, we found, and what was nice here is that we were able to rely a bit on meta-analyses that have already been conducted of the large body of research in this area, and I feel like it's reasonable to say that there's a sufficiently strong body of evidence at this point in the literature to support the notion that there is a significant relationship between ownership of media outlets, employment in minority employment in media outlets, and the nature of the content that is produced. There's been a wide-ranging literature in this area that has focused on a variety of different types of content outputs. And I would say this, though, that if there's one important shortcoming of this literature to date, is that, again, in terms of its usefulness going forward, is that there have not been the kind of robust indicators on the content side that are reflective of the range of critical information needs that Lou described that have been employed to assess this kind of relationship. So, for example, we'll see a fairly large body of literature that has looked, for example, at the relationship between minority ownership and, let's say, formats in radio. And are there minority-targeted formats, and are those more common amongst radio stations that are minority-owned? That has been useful information to understand. But going forward, it would be useful if we started to look a bit deeper into issues around the particular types of information that address the range of much more sort of granular critical information needs that Lou has already described. There's less of that kind of research that has dug a bit deeper in whatever operationalization you might think is most relevant, but to really get a bit deeper into understanding the nature of that relationship between ownership or employment and content. And here again, very important, I think, to emphasize that this body of literature has, to the large extent, focused on traditional media platforms and the relationships that exist there, and very little research at this point that has begun to investigate the ownership, employment, content relationship within the context of new media platforms and services, and so that's something going forward that there's a real opportunity to fill some gaps there. The third component that I'll be talking about is the issue of barriers to addressing to participation, barriers to participation by women, minority groups, other marginalized groups, to participation in the processes of media content production and distribution. Here again, a wide-ranging literature, though based on our findings, in fact, I think it's safe to say that the FCC has commissioned the bulk of the literature addressing these issues in the most rigorous way. So to some extent, I'm worried I'm going to tell folks here a lot of what they already know, but we tried to cast a wide net and make sure that we addressed everything. So we found it useful to sort of sort this literature into three categories of barriers. The first we might call barriers related to marketplace dynamics. These would be issues such as access to capital, issues such as the nature of how advertisers spend their money in the local media marketplaces. Some of you may be very familiar with the large and growing preference externalities literature, which has shown that minority groups tend to receive content addressing their particular needs and interests at levels that are much lower than the proportion of the local populations that they represent. And a lot of that has to do with the interaction, again, between advertiser support and content creation. So there's that sort of what we call marketplace level dynamics that are serving as significant barriers to participation in media content production and distribution. Second, we call them organizational barriers. This would be issues related to hiring practices, for example. We addressed in the review a substantial body of literature that continues to show really significant disparities in hiring, for example, of minority journalists at the local level. And when I say disparities, again, it's commonly conceptualized in terms of the extent to which their population in the professional sphere is reflective of the proportion of the population that demographic group represents in the surrounding community. We see that across a variety of platforms, across a variety of different types of professions. Issues of ownership. We could put into this category perhaps issues of that we identified in relation, for example, to allocation of spectrum and issues surrounding licensing processes and allocations where there was a fair bit of literature there as well. And then third, and this is where I'm going to sort of return to that phrase that Lou mentioned early on, the moving target of barriers to participation at the individual level. We thought it was particularly important to think about media content and production and distribution not purely as an organizational level activity anymore, of course, but also as an individual level activity. We talked about the notion of the deinstitutionalization of the media and how that is happening not at the national level but also at the local level. So here we start to talk about the issues related to problems such as broadband access and infrastructure deployment. And then when we talk about it being a moving target, and this is one area where I think more so than other areas, it felt as if the literature was keeping pace a bit more. But we see this evolution from thinking about sort of digital divide related issues as issues of access to technology and infrastructure, and those then evolving as some of those access to technology and infrastructure issues have become less severe to subsequent issues related to, for example, digital literacy or relevant training, et cetera, that relate to how people actually use these technologies, use these infrastructures. It was interesting as we were working on this and uncovering all the relevant scholarly literature, a couple of weeks back there was an article that some of you may have seen in the New York Times dealing with this particular issue, and if I remember right, the headline was, "Wasting Time is the New Digital Divide." And the idea was that what we're seeing across differences in socioeconomic status is that how children and teenagers spend their time online is differing substantially in terms of the degree to which they're engaging in educational activities online versus other types of activities. And I just use that as one example, as sort of a microcosm of this broader issue of trying to understand the nature of participation in the digital sphere and the kinds of divides that might be emerging in relation to how people use the tools that are available to them. And we, like I said, we are starting to see that the literature has sort of pushed this concept of digital divides into these new directions that sort of reflect the fact that as one problem may be solved, the solution to that problem may in fact lead to the existence of additional problems that then need to be addressed. And finally, to emphasize that, as Lou mentioned with information needs, also when we talk about these issues to barriers to participation, as an example I think I just mentioned illustrates pretty well that these things do really evolve over time. And just as our notion of what, for example, constitutes an effective definition of universal service is needed to evolve over time, our understanding of what truly involves effective and full, robust participation in a media ecosystem needs to evolve over time as well. And with that, I go back to you. Is that right, Lou?
Yes, it is. So I'm going to summarize our major findings, and then I'm going to pass back to Dean Wilson for conclusion and recommendations. First of all, we found in our review, and we did do, I should say, as you could hear from Professor Napoli, an exhaustive review of methods as well, or at least as exhaustive as we could do in the time frame allotted. We looked at analytical approaches, methods, metrics, available data sources, and resources that were available to answer the question of how the critical information needs of Americans were changing and how we might capture that change in a way that was adequate to the new shifting configuration of communities, demography, and the media itself. And that is no small challenge. We found that essentially that while there are some existing methods and there are some available data, there is some foundation for beginning to answer these questions, but bluntly, the existing analyses that exist and frankly the existing methods that are available simply do not effectively answer the questions that the FCC has posed. Frankly, we can't get there from here. We need to begin to think about new forms and new methods for conceptualizing these questions, and we need to begin to actually lead in this area rather than simply lag behind. We need to formulate new methods, and I'll speak to that in a moment. We need to begin to address how we capture these key barriers that Phil discussed, the shifting social dynamics that I've discussed, and as Dean Wilson has written about and others, the actual cost of exclusion. There are real costs to excluding people and communities, whole communities and neighborhoods from a digital society. Those just as if, and again I'm really summarizing Dean Wilson's research here quickly, just as there are benefits to inclusion, as Metcalfe's law is articulated by being included into a network, one is allowed exponential access to the benefits of that network. Being excluded from networks that exist also lead to potentially exponential costs. We don't know yet precisely how to model those costs, but we do know that the costs of exclusion are much greater than additive. And we need to begin to capture those costs of exclusion, again, not simply to individuals, but to whole communities and neighborhoods, and more broadly to the society as a whole. And we need methods that are capable of doing that. So what would that policy relevant research look like today? I want to stress that we have deep respect and appreciation of the contributions of large N econometric studies to the shape of the media universe. Much of what we know, as Phil just said, is based upon those studies, and we wouldn't be where we are today without the work of many people here at the FCC, Jonathan Levy among others, but if we didn't have this work, we could not stand on the foundation that we stand on today. However, we don't believe that that work alone can capture the complex dynamics and interdependencies of a multi-platform, digitally enabled local media ecology. In other words, much of that large N research was based upon a traditional media system, and we stress a traditional media system that also rested upon a fairly stable conception of communities. Just as newspapers depended upon stable demographics for over a 40 or 50 or in some cases 70-year period, so did the research that modeled the stability of traditional media in local markets. As we've all seen and as we've all probably experienced almost every day, that stability in society and in local communities no longer exists. And so we need to develop new methods and new metrics that can capture that changing complexity over time as it's occurring and not assume the relative stability of markets that we have in the past. How ought we to do that? We believe, and we are recommending based upon not only our review of the substantive needs, but of a range of methods, that we need to begin to develop a multi-level analytical framework that is grounded in data, we stress, that is grounded in good data and then wherever possible in the kinds of data that are available, from not least of which the Census Bureau and other models that depend upon firm and verifiable and generalizable ways of modeling local communities. But we also believe that we do need to look at the existing range of existing media measures, including the traditional methods of surveys and content analysis. Those will be important tools. But there are also the emerging tools of social network analysis. I think that we all recognize that social networks are not simply a buzzword, they're actually becoming increasingly the underlying structure of our social life. And if we can't capture the dynamic of that underlying structure, we cannot, in fact, speak to the changing information needs of local communities. That will require qualitative work in the very beginning to begin to dig more deeply into what the information needs of local communities are. It will require qualitative comparative work for those of you schooled in the social sciences, rigorous ways of comparing local communities, both within metropolitan or micropolitan areas, but also across metropolitan or micropolitan areas. How is LA like Houston? And how is LA not like Houston? How are each of them like Miami and not? We need to begin to answer those questions in a very rigorous and comparable way. Finally, to capture those dynamics, we need to develop what we've been calling, following the general usage, an ecological approach, which is to say that all of these multiple layers of local communities actually are connected to each other. They don't simply exist as static layers where information comes down from the top or information comes up from the bottom. In fact, they're in a complex interaction with each other, as Phil Napoli has said. Rigorous case studies that have been done, including some of my own work in Seattle, show that this is the case, that there are complex interactions. And we need methods that are capable of analyzing those complex interactions as they begin to emerge over time, and not simply to take static statistical snapshots of those communities. And so we've been using the framework of ecology, the terminology, I should say, of ecology, the more formal language. We were at NSF yesterday discussing this problem is really complex adaptive systems. I hate to throw buzzwords into the discussion here, but essentially what we need to do is capture communities in their complexity and motion. And I stress that there are very rigorous, tested, advanced methods for doing that. We have the tools to do that. Now we need the will to apply those tools to policy. Finally, I would like to say that we believe that we need to develop robust indicators, testable, verified indicators of performance. It's not simply enough that we policymakers or we social scientists know what the changing structure of local communities is. Citizens themselves need to know what's available in their local communities. They need indices that are simple and easy to read and simple to compare. They need to know, is my community getting the information that it needs or not? How is it doing compared to other communities that are similar to mine? If it's doing well, excellent. Why is it doing well? If it's not doing as well, where are we underperforming and how can we improve our performance over time? So we believe that that civic element, that citizen element of the kind of research that we do is also absolutely essential to good policy making going forward, so we can learn from communities while we're also studying the changing environment. And I turn it back to Dean Wilson.
Good. Thank you, Lou. I'm just going to end with a couple of comments that underscore what my colleagues have said. Given the federal mandate that's been provided to the Federal Communications Commission, we believe that the Federal Communications Commission cannot get to where they need to get to under the statute only using the approaches that have been used in the past. I just want to underscore that the Commission has legislative and judicial constraints to do certain things, and we believe that it is going to be impossible for them to do those things in the absence of certain kinds of changes to their models of analysis. In other words, they can't get there from here without making these changes. And again, as Lou said, we're not saying that traditional neoclassical economics should be tossed out of the window. This is not the argument that we're making. Neoclassical economics, so far as it goes, is a very powerful and useful tool. But it relies mainly on large N quantitative studies that focus on markets. And in today's environment, changing demographics, changing technology, new kinds of demands and needs on the part of citizens at the individual level, then new kinds of analytic approaches are needed to be added to the existing approach. One model we might think of is that if you're just trying to navigate across the Potomac River or around the world, then Newtonian physics is perfectly adequate. But at a certain point, when you are more ambitious and the world changes, you need quantum physics. And so we're suggesting that both Newtonian physics and quantum physics are both imperative for the Commission to continue to do the good work that it does. So therefore, what we conclude that this is not only an issue of collecting new data. The question is, what kinds of data are going to be collected? How should it be analyzed? And what kind of social science models can be brought to bear to explicate and then act on those models? We have identified at least 6 such models: the digital divide, the ecological system, etc. And I think the challenge for the Commission is to find ways which are parsimonious and powerful to bring these multi-models together to address, as Lou said, complex adaptive systems. And in this, I just want to suggest finally, speaking personally, that I do think that the Federal Communications Commission can lead the way in this work. This is an issue that Congress faces. As Lou said, we spent time yesterday with the National Science Foundation. They are looking for better ways to understand these same problems. So I think there's a kind of a historical opportunity here for the Federal Communications Commission not only to provide better regulatory guidance and policy, but also lead in the level of sort of conceptualizing what is coming to be one of the most important issues in the United States of America, which is the co-joining of increased diversification within communities and the ways in which those different and diverse communities employ both the legacy media and the new media so that the United States of America can become more internationally competitive and domestically more integrated, and to increase the quality of life of both communities and individuals. And with that, I want to say thank you very much on behalf of my colleagues, and to Mr. Reed, thank you, to the Commissioner, and we'd be happy to engage in debate and discussion at this point.
Ernest, Phil, and Lou, thank you very much for your presentation. I know I've said it before, but this was a significantly heavy lift that was completed in record time. So I know we here at the Commission really appreciate your effort. We appreciate your passion and your expertise. And obviously we look forward to working with you much further. This might be a good point. Before we go to the responses, I'd like to introduce Commissioner Clyburn, who's been gracious enough to join us. Commissioner Clyburn has been a real proponent, real advocate for getting the answers to these really important questions. So I want to give her an opportunity to address us and give us her thoughts. Commissioner.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Mr. Reed. I appreciate you yielding some time to me. I apologize for being a bit tardy. I got on the first plane I could, and it's always baggage claim that holds you up. So, again, good morning. First, allow me to express how encouraged I am by the interest in today's discussion, which addresses both the critical information needs of the American public as well as market entry barriers. At first glance, these issues may appear somewhat unrelated, but as was affirmed during this morning's exchange, they are tightly entwined. I am grateful for the incredible work submitted by scholars under direction of the University of Southern California's Annenberg School of Communications and Journalism, and would be remiss if I did not thank Chairman Janikowski for his support of this study. Today marks an important step for the FCC as we attempt to fulfill our statutory mandate to promote policies favoring a diversity of media voices, vigorous economic competition, technological advancement, and promotion of the public interest, convenience, and necessity. In addition to identifying and eliminating market entry barriers for small businesses, this study begins the charting of a course to a more effective delivery of necessary information to all citizens. It holds the promise of enabling them to live safer and healthier lives by highlighting any challenges and exploring a host of opportunities for full access to educational, employment, information and business opportunities, in addition to empowering them in their civic involvement. This literature review brings together disparate studies in order to produce a holistic overview of the ownership, employment, content relationship as it relates to the impact of women and minority participation in ensuring that all groups have their critical information needs met. This study affirms what I have long championed, that the FCC must devote more attention to meeting the critical information needs of all Americans by breaking down barriers, thus paving the way for new opportunities. The Commission must emphatically insist that we leave no American behind when it comes to meeting the information needs of those in varied and vibrant communities of our nation, be they native-born or immigrant, disabled, non-English speaking, low income, or other. Should another natural or man-made disaster occur, no one should be at risk of missing out on vital information, nor should they ever be denied a chance at meaningful and fulfilling employment or enfranchisement. When we fail to insist that the critical needs of all Americans are met, we send a message to those unserved and underserved communities, unintended or not, that they are not worth as much as those communities whose information needs are fully met. This further fuels alienation and isolation. I hope that we will continue to research the correlations between the ownership of enterprises owned by women, minorities, and underrepresented groups to the production and distribution of critical information needs. Diverse voices often bring with them diverse ideas on how to reach diverse communities, and the study highlights this through its first recommendation that the FCC should devote greater attention to the barrier of underrepresentation of some groups in media ownership and employment. It follows a recommendation by admonishing the Commission to recognize that the cost of network exclusion are borne not only by the excluded, but by the society at large, and increases exponentially with the continued growth and expansion of information and communication networks in our society. My office has continuously fought hard to drive this point home in all of the work that the Commission does, and I am eminently pleased to see that the importance of our message has been recognized in this report. 2 final points. First, I wish to make a plea that this agency and my fellow commissioners continue the often arduous but always worthwhile endeavor of collecting vital data like we have before us today, and that we use this data to inform our relevant policymaking decisions with the ultimate goal of ensuring that the information marketplace is one that serves all of our citizens optimally. And 2, I must thank all of you for truly making this day one of my best here at the agency. You are driven, purpose-filled thought leaders who are invested in and committed to this worthwhile effort. Dean Wilson, as one of my staffers calls him, the Oracle, has a long, rich history on these issues and is the perfect captain for this ship. Mark Lloyd and Tom Reed and many others whom I rely on for guidance, you are incredible. Please know how enriched we all are by your contributions to this dialogue and to all of your challenges that you are and will continue to issue to us for us to truly serve America. Thank you so much for yielding this time to me.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Before we continue, just a couple housekeeping details. These proceedings are being streamed live, so for those who are following us online, when we get to the Q&A session, please feel free to submit your questions to literature.review@fcc.gov. Again, that's literature.review@fcc.gov. So with that, I want to continue. We've got our additional panelists here who are going to respond to the report, Professors Park, Ladd, and Hamilton. So I will cede the floor to them.
It's not.
Yes, you. Just go ahead.
Okay. First, congratulations again to the USA Annenberg School and University of Wisconsin for completing high-quality major review of literature in a very short amount of time. This is extremely well-written piece of the work with a great amount of very useful information summarized in a very concise manner. The report reviewed a major study in key area of information need. Each area answering 3 questions posed has 2 components. One is synthesis of. Thank you.
Not quite. Not going that way. Just a little closer.
Synthesis of existing studies, and then each subsection contained specific recommendation for numeric estimating impact of various components of media ecosystem. The approach again has been holistic, and I strongly believe the main contribution of this report is author's ability to discern the underlying concern throughout the main study. I particularly appreciate the report's urge to redefine the metrics of participation and digital skill and competence and digital divide issue. Having said so many things to say about this report, please allow me just briefly mention some of the missing gaps that I believe could have been pointed out in this particular report, and emerging area concern that in my assess needs more of our collective attention. For this, 2 issues drew my attention. With one is concerning new information platform, and the other about information itself in relation to individuals. First, in Section 3, report rightly redefined the notion of participation in terms of not just access to the infrastructure, but also quality engagement with media ecosystem. For this, I wanted to see a bit of broader discussion about mobile device and related digital competence issue. In fact, 2011 Pew data suggests 46% of American adults now own some sort of smartphone devices. And when it comes down to underserved community, such as African American, the numbers goes up. Some of the survey actually indicate 53% of African American under age of 35 actually rely on mobile for information access. In fact, recent research actually suggests there is strong impact of the mobile use in political and civic participation. And however, potential barrier concerning underserved community has not been fully examined yet. For information access as well as political economic participation is increasingly moving into the mobile and wireless platform. I strongly believe this dimension of mobile information access is a critical dimension to be recognized. Second, examine critical information needs and existing barrier among American public. I also had hoped draft contain some of the discussion on quality of information itself at the content level. I strongly believe this is very much relevant issue when we investigate information need concerning minority. For instance, it is right to ask what type of representation available for public to consume information about minority itself from the dominant media courses. At Howard, actually, we have many students actually interested in media representation and misrepresentation about minority issue, and open portraying the black as a lawbreaker and Latino as only illegal alien. To just name a few, mainstream media where most people still find the information about public policy issue, hugely responsible for perpetuating the unfounded myths about undocumented immigration, perhaps contributing the fragmentation of American public in understanding this issue. Putting it into another context, high level of distrust among the minority community about news media is quite understandable because misinformation about minority society continue. Considering majority of news, entertainment, and information still feeding to the online, coming from the major conventional news media, I think the quality of information there should be examined as well. Perhaps related to the whole issue is the fact that we are essentially dealing with a proprietary media system. Either we are discussing social network site or a more conventional broadcasting system. This is why I believe our discussion should ultimately lead to a tangible policy measure where the commercial media market system fails to serve the public interest. In closing, I wish to note that my absolute agreement in many part of the report, and especially in conclusion, the report says, again, pointing out the diverse society and communication is the one that actually essential component in binding the diverse nation together. I'm very excited with lots of great ideas actually presented in the report. And reading this report, I again realize how important it is a scholarly community come together and pursue this critical issue together. Once again, congratulations on the completion of this wonderful draft. Thank you.
Well, I would also like to thank. Okay. I would also like to thank the FCC for having me here, and I'd like to thank the authors of the report for writing an excellent report, a very thorough literature review. Most of my comments will focus on expanding some of the things that were already discussed and some suggestions for expanding them. And in particular, I'll focus a bit more on my area of expertise, which is more on the individual level and how individual people learn, and a little bit more on how they learn civic and political information, because that's my area of expertise as a political scientist. I especially, as did Dr. Park, I especially liked the focus here that it's important not just to have access to information, but to have real engagement with the information. And I'll just expand a little bit on that. I think in thinking about, the main point that I think you make, and I would only encourage us to reiterate even more strongly, is that what we know both in research now and research historically is that access to information is not enough. It's generally necessary, but far from sufficient for people to gain civic and political information, other types of information. It's important, I think, to put this in the context of the older, more traditional media systems. So we knew before thinking about how all this relates to the modern, more fragmented media system, right? So political scientists did a lot and other survey research did a lot of studies of how informed people were in the old media environment in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and found large amounts of information inequality there, right? Even then. So it's not like things were good and we're creating all these problems. We already had information inequalities pre-existing. A lot of those information inequalities were not perfectly correlated with education levels, but pretty strongly correlated with people's level of education, and also more weakly, but still significantly correlated with race, gender, other sorts of the demographic variables traditionally associated with traditionally disadvantaged groups. So we had that in the sort of the old media environment. The new media environment, there's a lot of good research suggesting that provides many people with opportunities to become more informed than they were previously, but also many people opportunity to become less informed than they were previously. And access to new media environments does not necessarily, it's not always a good thing and can sometimes be a bad thing depending. So we need to think about the consequences of that. It relates to what was said in the presentation, and I hadn't seen that article, but I like the title of it, sort of wasting time is the new digital divide, right? So access to greater broadband, greater internet access, greater access even just to cable television, stuff like this, could in certain environments and with certain people with certain backgrounds and educational resources allow them to become more informed about local civic affairs, politics, other public safety issues, but also could lead some people to be more distracted. There's a lot of research that depending on if they don't have the educational or other sorts of resources available to them to know where to seek out information and news and know how to process that information in a useful way. There's a lot of research by Marcus Pryor at the Woodrow Wilson School that you include in your bibliography, I believe, but I'll just reemphasize it, right, that finds that access to more information causes some people with interest and resources to become more informed and some people to become less as they get distracted because political and civic information opportunities come with the opportunity to also do other things as well with your time. This relates to the change that could be a problem in that in the industry thinking beyond the individual level to the industry level. We used to have a time where the big change is we used to have a time where information was heavily bundled, right? In that newspapers would bundle sort of local information with national information, with sports entertainment information, with arts information, and all this were bundled together. And so if you wanted any aspect of that, you would get all of it. So if you were interested in the sports, you would also get some local news, some national news, some arts entertainment, some public safety news, all this together. And now those things are no longer bundled. And a similar, not exactly quite the same way, but similar thing happens with television news, although not to the extreme, right? In that a lot of information was a bit more bundled in network newscasts that are just a little more fragmented as fewer people watch network newscasts. That's not quite as true with local television news, which is still very popular, although I'm not claiming that always has all the information you need, but it's at least its popularity has been consistent over time, for better or worse. So the big question then is, we know from that more information and more options because of the end of bundling, right? Because you have to seek out information more now. It doesn't come to you because things are no longer bundled, right? It's not clear if there is an economic model that can lead decoupled news sources that provide, only civic and political information to people, whether there's a viable business model for that, especially at the local level. Because the previous model depended a lot more on bundling than the new models do. At the national level, related to bundling, there is this tendency for the media industry to have this winner-take-all tendency, right? In that you have national news organizations, some which are very successful, and there have been studies of this by Matt Heidemann at George Washington and others that find that, right, in the web there are many more options than there used to be, but not many more sources that are actually widely used. So, in fact, you have fewer sources that are widely used. So the few most popular news, national political information sites are things like CNN.com, NewYorkTimes.com, all these sort of things, FoxNews.com, all these sort of things. But there are fewer that are read to a small degree. So we have this winner-take-all environment, which feeds then into the tendency of some people to become more informed and some people less, right? And this winner-take-all environment does not so far include a real industry niche for local information sources. I think it's really not clear whether there will be a viable business model for debundled news sources that are private, providing local information, local information on local schools, local libraries, local public safety, information about local candidates running for office. Even in the old media environment, where we had this bundling, political scientists for a long time found that people knew less about their local political situation and who their local representative was and what local ordinances were under consideration, what were being passed. They knew less about that than national public affairs. I don't think we have data on this, but everything that is happening would suggest me to believe that this is making this issue worse. So I would agree with the authors of the report that this is a serious problem and we need more work on that. And because to the extent that there are sources of local information, it's more opt-in than it used to be, even more. So in the old media environment, we had this problem where there was some bundling but not enough, so you had to opt in to get local news, and fewer people got local information than did before. And everything would lead us to believe that problem is worse, maybe a lot worse than it used to be. So I don't want to use up all my time. So let me talk about a little bit about their recommendations and what I would add to them. So they point out that information usually still originates with traditional media sources, and the information that does get out, it originates with traditional media sources and then sort of cascades through the media system and perhaps through social networks as well. I would suggest that a reason for that is that for these newer types of media, that's a low-cost way of getting information. And these newer types of media, it's not clear that they have a viable business model and so don't have a lot of resources to expend to get this information. So as traditional media sources cut back, and so this low-cost source of information that they are providing perhaps lessens over time. One thing we need to find out is whether it's government or whether it's some other nonprofit organization, something else, can provide other low-cost sources of news. Because given the uncertainty that there is a viable business model to provide local, especially local civic information and political news. Providing information at low costs, I think, will be very important, and that problem is why they're relying so much on these traditional sources to the extent they do still exist. My other recommendation for the recommendations would be to look beyond that and look for new opportunities to make information available at lower cost and easier, and look for new opportunities for bundling. Not bundling in the old way, where there's one newspaper that provides information together, but look for, because we know that people have different abilities to find information, and that those different abilities to find information and absorb it are exacerbated in this new media environment. To solve that problem, we want to figure out ways to put information where it's easy to get, right? And reduce the opt-in nature of the new media environment, right? So we know that when things are more opt-in rather than opt-out to get your information, there's greater inequality in how much people acquire it based on educational resources and socioeconomic resources. So think of ways to do that. And I don't have all the solutions of that today, but I think we need to think a little more outside the box in how to put information along with other things that people enjoy doing or regularly do. Because that's how you reach people who don't necessarily have the resources to know where to look for information, right? And aren't necessarily socialized to regularly look for it all the time. Put information in accessible places, whether it's physical places or media places, alongside other things people do regularly or alongside other entertainment options. And it's a little unconventional, but I think that's a potentially useful and important thing for us to do in the future. Let me see. I would finally, in the recommendations, I would second the recommendation to really think about different sizes of communities as working differently, especially having different problems. Right. In the old media environment, we had a good study that found that, for example, in smaller metro areas, there was a lot more coverage of the member of Congress and who was running for Congress and just their names and what they were doing in Washington. And larger metro areas, you had more coverage of national affairs, but fewer coverage of members of Congress and what they were doing because there were so many of them, not for understandable reasons, right? And those types of differences between big and small communities in what information is out there and easily available and what information you have to seek out, and thus only a few people will seek it out, are likely to be more exacerbated, I think, in the new media environment. But we don't know. There have been some studies of that, but given the importance of that, there haven't been enough. And I think we need more studies of information differentials between big and small media markets and the effect of that. Finally, and the recommendations for exactly what type of studies could address this, I would dissent a little bit in suggesting that I think traditional sort of empirical quantitative studies can still be very useful in answering a lot of the questions we have. I think it's good always to use a mix of methods depending on what is most useful for the question available. So this is not disagreeing with and on that I'm not disagreeing with the paper, with the report. And I think when possible, in thinking about these complicated problems without easy solutions in terms of how to get information out in a media environment characterized by more choice, I think it's important to use all sort of available theory to think about the consequences of any reforms as well as the unintended consequences of reforms, whether that's theory that comes from the field of communication or from sociology or from microeconomics. These can all be, I think, quite useful for thinking about both consequences and unintended consequences. So thank you for the opportunity to comment on this report, and I look forward to the final version, and thank you very much.
There should be a lag in the microphone, and then eventually it'll come on. Great. All right. We call that learning by doing. So I'd like to say that this is an outstanding literature review. It's really done a stellar job at identifying 8 different categories of critical information needs and talking not only about access to that information, but how that information is used and how it can change decisions. So I think it's a phenomenal review. I also think it makes a great case for trying to develop what the authors call a multi-level analytical framework that can be used across communities, and that in part is rooted in the community ecological framework. That was hard for me to say, and it's sometimes hard to envision, and I think that it's the type of work that should be done, and I really look forward to seeing these authors flesh that out. So I'd only like to offer 4 suggestions, things to think about. Number 1, given the work that you've done, it would be great if you could describe to people why this type of research is so hard to do so that people understand. And here are my nominees for that. Number 1, information is endogenous. That means that there are some factors which lead people to desire to consume information about public affairs. Those same factors may lead them to be politically active, and that makes it hard to isolate the independent impact of information on political activity. And the authors acknowledge that, and that's something that could be stressed. Also, in collective decisions, the chain of causation is large. I could get exposed to information. I might consume it. It might change my opinions. It might change my actions. I could be the marginal voter. My Congress member could be the swing voter. Identifying the chain of causation in this type of information and community decisions is really hard. And then a final difficulty is we have no agreed upon definition of a public interest function. So that can be hard to evaluate the outcomes of collective decisions. Sometimes economists, and I'll admit to being some days a large N economist, sometimes what economists do is they use cost-benefit analysis. But if you use cost-benefit analysis, you're keeping score by willingness to pay. And if you think about low-income individuals, that can put them at a disadvantage. So my first suggestion was, you've done such a great job looking at the literature, let other people know why it's so hard to come to conclusions. A second recommendation would be, you've really looked across many different disciplines, and it would be great if you could sort of provide a greatest hits assessment of what a particular discipline would say about these problems. So as an economist, I would probably give you words like public goods, positive externalities, and high fixed cost. And I think that when economists do this type of research, what they would say is, because information is a public good, it's going to be underprovided, people free ride. Because public affairs coverage in a newspaper generates positive externalities that can't be fully monetized, it makes editors less willing to investigate in investigative reporting. We know that advertiser-supported medium are biased against statistical minorities with intensely held preferences and are biased against high-cost stories, because all advertisers are concerned about is, did you stay still to watch the story? So thinking about fixed cost, which you did in your preference externalities, if you could tell people the greatest hits from other disciplines like that, that would be, as an economist, really helpful to me. A third thing that could be a suggestion is, you really make a great point that we are in the era of big data. And if you look at NSF, if you look at Homeland Security, they are actually supporting universities like Georgia Tech, Carnegie Mellon, to figure out how you can do data mining to deal with questions, patterns of decisions that individuals are making. If you think about lowering the cost of discovering public affairs stories at the local level, right now there are thousands of hours of city council videotape. There are millions of forms at the local level that are locked into PDFs. There's a lot of information that would be helpful to journalists and to academics. Journalists would like to hold local governments accountable. We'd like to study how journalists hold local governments accountable. And so other parts of the government are studying to fund software in the era of big data, and that might be something that you all could help draw attention to. And my fourth point is related to that. I really like the fact that your research is looking across many different aspects of media policy. In the past, a lot of the research has been linked to the ownership debates, and that was proper because they were generated during rulemakings or during mandated reviews of rules. But one role that your research and one role that the FCC could play is to focus the attention of other agencies on how they could help serve the information needs of communities. So Professor Ladd, for instance, was talking about local public affairs information and why it's so difficult for the market to support that. Right now, the IRS is currently holding up the approval of nonprofit applications from many online local public affairs websites because they're trying to struggle with the development of a policy on how you recognize how you recognize nonprofit media. The research that you've generated that clearly shows the educational impact of public affairs reporting would be helpful to the IRS when it tries to figure out maybe nonprofit local websites could be brought in under the educational aspect. Number two, if you look at NSF, in many parts of NSF, including its digging into data competition, they're trying to figure out how they can support the development of algorithms that make data mining easier. If FCC and your research could show them, here's a type of information creation that has great positive spillovers, things relating to local communities. Maybe they could subsidize the creation of software, just like they do in the Homeland Security area, that would help us hold government accountable. And so finally, if you think about the federal government spends over $1 billion a year in advertising, and local governments like New York City spend a significant amount of money. In New York City, I'm told that a lot of the advertising is simply directed to buses and to subways, which are great, but it could also be directed to ethnic media. One reason it's not is because there's a higher transaction cost. Dealing with 40 different individual ethnic media might be more costly than saying, let's put it on a bus or put it in the subway. But what I think your research can do is remind people that the market's failing to generate public affairs information. The government, through its actions in many different areas, IRS, NSF, the purchasing of advertising, could support the development of the information that you would like to generate. So I really salute you for doing a tough task, and the fact that you did it in 2 months makes me jealous.
Thank you, Professor Zepp. We'll have maybe about 10 minutes or so of responses to some of the points that the professors have raised.
Well, first of all, I want to thank, this was very much a draft. We thought of this very much as a draft, and we really welcome the comments that the three of you made, and we also look forward to comments that others will make so we can make this a better report. I think that's what we're all looking for. Our ego is not yet all tied up in this document. So I just want to thank the three, our three colleagues. I am also aware that another member of our team, Dr. Janic, is here. Dr. Janic, I think, is in the room. Yes, right here. And I just want to thank him for his participation in some of our earlier discussions when we met in preparation for this. I want to thank you for coming as well. I wanted to just maybe say one thing that I'm going to ask my colleagues to raise the issue, raise issues that they want to respond to, that has to do with the mobile platforms. Apps. I think that's extremely important. We do need to pay more attention to that. And again, the data are contradictory because while it is the case that young minorities, including males, may have greater cell phone usage than others, it's not clear if they have access to smartphones. And so then we have to figure out what kind of information the public interest is available on smartphones but not on the others. But I think that's the whole question of mobility is an important one. I also very much like your idea of the quality of information. And I understand that my colleagues at the FCC get nervous when we start talking about the quality of information for very good reasons. But one example, one of my colleagues at USC looked at the production of news in the Los Angeles area for half-hour news shows. And he found that when you take out sports, entertainment, violence, fires, etc., there were 29 seconds of hard local news in a half-hour news program. And while those are tough issues maybe for certain federal agencies to address, I think as scholars, we really do have to address that. And I think you're right to raise it. Maybe there are ways to get into that by federal agencies without bumping up against the problem of free speech and looking at content. But I want to thank you for that, those observations. So let me just open it up to others, Phil.
I think just the issues that Jonathan and to some extent that James both raised highlighted for me what I suspect is a bit of a tension going forward as far as how the Commission wants to design future research, because on the one hand there was the question that guided that particular section of the report as articulated by the Commission was what media provide critical community information regardless of how they are used by citizens. And I thought I took that as such an important constraint on the relevant literature for us. And I think and I've been engaged in that discussion for quite some time about, is that an appropriate constraint? Do we let, to what extent is it part of the scope of what policymakers should be thinking about here? Which are the dynamics of how the information is actually used? How does it affect? How is it put to use? Is it consumed at all? Is it a pure supply side analysis, or do we really integrate? And some people would argue that at this point the landscape is so massive to really analyze in any meaningful way that almost by necessity that the practical way of narrowing the scope of the analysis is to use the dynamics of consumption, what is actually being consumed, and then that becomes the analytical frame, so to speak. But and I don't know to what extent Commission folks want to will be jumping in on this dialogue, but I think that's such an important issue. To what extent do the patterns of consumption that we see become part of how we conceptualize any analysis going forward? I mean, there's no denying that it's important in the grand scheme of things. Should it be part of this particular research mandate? And because it inevitably arises that it's vital to understand the full nature of the process.
Lou?
I'd like to actually thank you, Phil, for bringing up that point. I think that's critical. Sorry for my endless stories here, but I was on the Oregon coast recently, and as I was driving up and down, there were frequent signs that said tsunami high ground this way. Now, if you surveyed most Americans in Oregon, or most Oregonians, you said, what are your most important information needs? What are your preferences? Very few of them would say signs that indicate the tsunami high ground. However, if a tsunami was coming, that would rise very quickly to becoming a high priority. And I think that this is an important point. Phil brings this up. It's in a market-driven society, and Jonathan brought this up too, people prefer information, and Professor Park as well. So sure, there's Kaiser data, and it's very good. It's the best data we've got, at least, that shows that young people consume 11 hours of media every day in terms of multitasking, but young minorities consume 13 hours a day. African American, Latino users, 13 hours a day of media. And I guess, we could sort that out, but we can probably guess that most of it's not checking out the tsunami warning or checking out who their local, congressperson is. It's entertainment media. Now, that's okay. We understand that this is an entertainment-driven system and that most people most of the time will consume things that please them. There's nothing wrong with that. That's the basis of our communication system in many ways. But the point here, and this goes to Phil's point, is that there will be many times when my baby's sick, then I need to know where the well baby care is. If my kid needs to get into school, all of a sudden I need to know where the best schools are in town if I'm going to have a choice. And that may not be the top of, you run a survey, standard quantitative survey, that won't be the top of mind information that most people say is most critical to them. So we need to find methods that actually dig a little bit deeper than simply asking people their top of mind preferences. That's a very important point that both Jonathan and Dr. Park raised. The mobility issue, I'll just concur with Dr. Wilson. That's essential. We need to understand not just the extent of mobile use, but the quality of mobile use, and particularly the quality of smartphone use. And we have some data on that. The Pew data is good, but it's giving us marginals and descriptives. We don't have really what I would call as good of research data on that as we might have. And I just would concur with most of what Dr. Ladd said about particularly the knowledge gap issue, although you didn't frame it in those terms of Marcus Pryor's work. We talked about that a little bit in the report, but that's a critical point, is that knowledge, we tend not to look at it this way because we see a universe of information. Everyone's getting richer. Everyone has more information. The web gives us more and more. But in fact, starting all the way with Verba Schlossman's and Brady's classical work in 1995 to the present, we know that actually information can make the rich richer and the poor poorer in terms of what they know. And that's very critical to understand, that the information is not simply an endless source of wealth. It's actually a source that gets divided. And more informed people become more informed, but less informed people become relatively less informed, and in some cases, relatively disenfranchised. And to Jay's points, Professor Hamilton's points, part of my informality, Jay. First of all, any time that you say that you envy us, now I'm really happy for getting this done. But there's so much that you said that I think is important. I don't want to go through it point by point, other than to say that I want to just touch on your last point. There are ways, and we touched on this in the report, but we didn't really get into it in the depth that we should have and would have liked to have. There are new methods for using latent semantic analysis and large N data algorithmic methods to actually do sophisticated content analysis in local communities. We actually can begin, if we develop the modeling techniques, to apply those large N big data techniques to understanding the complexity of local communication. This is not something it's not pie in the sky or futuristic work. This is, as you point out quite correctly, being done right now in terrorism analysis. If we can apply it to the analysis of terrorism, we ought to be able to apply it to the public needs of local communities in the United States. And there's no reason that we can't, and we ought to be doing it.
On that topic, there's just one data source that we should have mentioned in our report, and we really didn't. I should just plug it, which is some of that's happening at MIT. I don't know if people are familiar with the Media Cloud database that the folks at the Center for Civic Media are doing. But as this discussion was ongoing, I thought, boy, that's sort of the direction. And you got me thinking about that as ways that can be calibrated towards some of the kinds of issues that the Commission would be wanting to address.
Okay. I think now we've got some time to take some questions from the audience. Dan Margolis from my office will be circling around with the mic, so you give an opportunity to identify yourself and your organization and address your question.
Hi, my name is Melissa Kornick. I operate a website in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. It's called oneifmylandbuckscounty.com, and it's a hyperlocal information site. I'm a black Native American, but I'm also operating in an affluent white community, so we need to look at the exchange that goes on in the opposite direction. What I see, and of course, Bucks County, Pennsylvania is where Washington crossed the Delaware and created a new form, or a form of democracy that's highly respected around the world, and many people in Bucks County still live up to that. So essentially what I see is a difference going on where people need to have information that may not be on your list, but they're really concerned about sustainability. They're really concerned, there's a lot of high anxiety over energy consumption. How do we conserve energy? So we're talking about middle America in an affluent area who have the same kind of anxieties as, say, a poorer community might have over some other issues. And then what I see also, we provide a platform for people to showcase what's of concern to them. These are issues that are not in the local papers. My background is that I am a former investigative producer. I worked at 60 Minutes, Dateline, 2020, Nightline. My stories were always original. And so when I look at my stories against what I'm looking at now, the people are very, very concerned about things that often journalists don't go to. And then finally, so we have that anxiety in the community over sustainability. I have an anxiety over marketing. So I think that when you're minority, female, and you have something that's hyper-local and free, you want it to get out to the community. And so what I see is a dearth of support in marketing for a lot of hyper-locals. Thank you.
Any responses?
Maybe we could collect some.
Okay. Well, Alice, I've got one question here from Tom Glazier, who is the Media Policy Fellow, Open Tech Initiative at the New America Foundation. This is one of our internet questions. And Tom asks, he says, the breadth and depth of this literature review provides many possible paths forward. Given that much of its value is in how the study drives data collection forward that ultimately informs commission decision-making, do the authors have any concrete and specific data collection efforts that could be undertaken in the near future? Do you want to take a couple more questions?
Yeah, I think
okay.
Thomas was too lazy to raise his hand.
My name is Christian Vogler, and I work at Gallaudet University. My focus is on technology, and I have a question for you today. I'm a little bit concerned about the needs for people with disabilities, specifically deaf people and blind people. So the survey shows that there's about 48 million deaf and hard of hearing people in the United States. And other numbers show that there's about 25 million blind people in the United States. So obviously those are two quite sizable groups who are struggling to access information. For example, deaf people have a large problem accessing television, radio, and online videos. For example, there's currently no captioning on website media, and blind people are struggling as well with video descriptions and online media because a lot of web pages are not accessible to their screen readers. So, in my opinion, it would make sense to add another group to the people being studied in the survey with barriers, specifically people with disabilities, and analyzing the choice of media and the impact that that has on these groups of individuals.
Let me take one more.
I'm Justin Swain, member of Women in Film and Video, along with Arlington Independent Media. One of the problems I've observed is ownership of content. So if I wanted to draw on something which I've seen on TV or heard on the radio, well, if you pay us big dollars, we'll let you use it. But that goes to my credibility of reference to the original source. The ownership of the media versus Creative Commons modeling. I would advocate a decay time on the ownership so that in the short term, yes, if you have images and sound of a breaking news story, yes, if your crew is out there shooting it or you paid the original recorder for it, be allowed some time to make some money off of it. But after that, yes, put it in Creative Commons so that we don't have to listen to third-party commentators later who conveniently ignore a lot of facts that are out there. Thank you.
Why don't we work this way? And so why don't you start and we'll just work along.
Okay. First of all, Ms. comment. I think that's a excellent point about the problems of marketing of hyperlocals and how, and this goes to Professor Hamilton's question too, how can transaction costs for small and medium-sized producers in local markets be systematically reduced? And what forms of policy can be used, and Jay referenced advertising, to actually encourage the pooling of transaction costs so that instead of your marketing being simply your problem, it might be that by banding together and creating a meso level of markets, that it's possible that that would increase everyone's visibility and lower everyone's transaction costs. And I think that that's a critical area for us to look at. How do we actually create the lowering of transaction costs, which of course is a key barrier for any media producer, small or medium-sized media producer, and particularly affects minority, low-income media producers. And so we think that's a very important area to be looking at. I'm glad you raised that. I'll actually come back to Tom's question, Tom Glazer's question. As far as Christian Vogler's question, which I thought was very, very important, I have to confess that when I was working on this report, we did have sections on disabilities, and particularly on blind and hard of people who had hearing impairment. But there's an incredible dearth of the literature that we found in the communications area, though some of the little that I found was on transportation, for example, which spoke to the needs of people of differing abilities to actually read transportation information, to get proper transportation information. But that seemed to me like we were barely scratching the surface. So I would welcome any additions that you could send us. If you know of research that we should have included that we didn't, and I'm sure there must be some, please do let us know. Frankly, I thought that was one of the most important failings of our lit review. I expected to find a lot more than I did, and I was particularly sorry that we didn't. So I want to, sorry is not the point, but we'd like to make that better. So,
can I jump in on that too?
Yeah, sure, please do.
Part of the section that we're working on that examined, how do media meet different critical information needs? It's an explicit conclusion that we actually drew in the review, which was that too often the overwhelming majority of that literature really tended to focus on issues related to the African American and Hispanic community, and particular other relevant community groups such as hard of hearing or the blind were neglected in the research related to a number of the different questions that we were looking at. So it's a point that we actually highlighted in the review, where there's a real gap, as Lou pointed out, in the scholarly literature in this area.
Can I just ask Catherine to also jump in here, since she was one of the people who was really looking through that literature? Do you want to address the issue?
Yeah,
you have to lean forward into the mic.
I'm sorry, I can just briefly confirm what Lou was saying. We were looking specifically for literature that speaks to the need of people with disabilities, hard of hearing, or blind, and it's really difficult to come by something that addresses the information needs in particular of those people. There's some literature in other area, but this one there was very little, and so we kind of think that there should either be analysis that need to be further conducted by us or someone else in this area, or we were happy to be pointed to any additional information that you may have to offer us that we can include. We'd be very grateful if you can contact us with that.
I have just two more quick comments, and one is that regarding the question of Creative Commons, we think that, and this goes to your question too, the problem of how commons form in local communities, which also goes to the question of meso-level or mid-level media that might provide some promise in plugging some of the public information gaps, including the bundling questions that Professor Ladd addressed. We think that if we move to the next phase of research, and we certainly hope to, we want to examine precisely how various kinds of mid-level media, commons media, so-called hyperlocal media, I don't think that's quite the right term, but that's the common term of usage, how those can actually begin to bridge those gaps, and commons models are part of that. And that speaks to Tom Glazer's question as well. We do hope to engage in some systematic study of complete media environments in local communities to varied by scale, varied by obviously racial, ethnic, immigration, composition, SES, and so on, the dimensions that we discussed in the report that might point us towards what these models would actually look at. I've done some extensive work in Seattle, which is in many ways an ideal case study. It's almost too ideal in many ways because they have all these layers of media working together, and they are supporting each other, partly because the newspaper, the Seattle Times, has been one of the most forward in the country in actually taking advantage and partnering with hyperlocal media, which also creates effectively an ecological bundling effect. It's not that the Times is doing it, but the ecology effectively bundles. And to go to Jay's point, it effectively bundles semantically, at least by coupling similar kinds of problems with each other and giving it a view. Now, is that an answer? I don't know if it's an answer, but it's one model.
If I can just come in and add one point on the Creative Commons question. Our literature review, in part because of limitations on time, was limited to peer-reviewed literature at this point. But another point that your comment raises is information that is available from the consumers of media and from the local communities themselves. And ideally what we would be engaging in is participatory research that would actually allow those who have the greatest stake in the outcome of this research to have an active voice. And hopefully there will be opportunities as we go forward and design that kind of research to be able to bring in the kind of hyperlocal information that is available on blogs and on websites, but also actually going into communities and gathering information, gray literature, flyers, posters on the wall that we really have no way of capturing in a rigorous way in this kind of format.
Maybe I'll just say one quick question about Mr. Glazer's query. This has been a very exciting process because it is, speaking selfishly as a scholar, it's been an opportunity to be engaged with other scholars, both immediately in this team and even more broadly. And I think that what this initiative has probably done is prompted those of us who already work in this area to want to do more. And we also hope that it has prompted folks who don't work in this area to want to move into it. And so we're hoping that this kind of very fruitful partnership between a federal agency and the scholarly community can continue. We did recommend that new methodologies, new concepts, new ways of looking at and collecting data should be continued by the Federal Communications Commission. And as you know, this is just a literature review. And so we are hoping that the Commission will make a decision that this is an area that they want to pursue, but that is entirely in the discretion of the Commission.
Hi, I'm Mike Ravino. I just moved to D.C. to start a new Civic Affairs television channel, and I'd like to specifically address what Mr. Reed has asked for, barriers to entry. I think the Cable Act itself is a barrier to entry for any new participant in civic affairs programming. That Cable Act put into place the government access channels and the education access channels, and it gave the cable industry a huge competitive advantage. What we've seen happen is that industry has built C-SPAN, which touts itself as a nonprofit organization, yet it generates $63 million a year. It charges the cable providers 6 to 9 cents per subscriber, and the cable industry then charges the citizens a minimum $30 a month to get government content. Our civic channel is free to the public, built for broadcasters, yet we will have to charge advertising, charge for advocacy messaging, and actually address a lot what Dr. Ladd and Dr. Hamilton were mentioning about what is a new model for civic affairs. We came to the conclusion to build this network because we did a semantic analysis. We actually studied the city of Eugene, Oregon, and we studied Washington, D.C. And I would like to bring up that it's not just the Cable Act, I think, is in the way, but but it is in the way that the television and media industry actually sells advertising. In the television world, we use what is called the DMA, a designated market area. This was a relic of the old analog television system. It basically says as far as your signal can go is where your market is. Well, that's not the reality in today's multi-leveled, multi-interactive world. What the Nielsen ratings do is that they blend the urban cores, the suburban areas, and the rural areas into what the industry now touts as, there's only 17 to 20% over-the-air television viewers, people who just use antennas. Well, in our analysis, we used the more granular approach. We went down to the local jurisdictional level, and what we have found out is that number is actually double. As an example, Eugene, Oregon, population of about 150,000 people, all the government officials thought that they had a 70 to 85% cable rate. I conducted an official records request, matched it against the 2010 census data. I came up with a number of 51%. I did the same for Washington, D.C., did an official records request. Now, just to be clear, the Washington metro area, the designated market area, is approximately 6 million people. The district itself is, we'll call it 600,000. When you pull the records requests, 55 to 56% of the people have cable, the remainder do not. Add a few more percentage in for satellite, you're still pulling 40% that don't have cable. Now, what does that mean? That means those people are not getting local government access programming. They're not getting education access programming. The Cable Act actually has institutionalized this barrier. So we can't change all that. Congress has to change the Cable Act. So as a job creator, as a civic entrepreneur, we're coming forward with the broadcast industry to try to serve this underserved audience and give them civic content. We just are going to have to charge some advertisers to do it. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Angela Campbell. Helps to have the microphone the right way. Georgetown University Law Center. I had a couple of different questions and comments. One is for Dr. Friedland. While I don't disagree with the 8 categories, I'd like to hear more about how you chose those particular categories and not others. It seems to me that they're kind of disparate, and some are really big, some are not so big. And there's other things that might be important too, such as children. I didn't see anything about children specifically. Another thing might be important is that people of different ethnicities and genders and backgrounds see themselves reflected in on the programming about their communities. So that's just a question. I guess another comment that I think is something that could be helpful in terms of future research is that a lot of times you say, well, there's a fair amount of research on the traditional media, but not a lot about the new media. And I guess it would be helpful to sort of parse, like, why it seems to me some of these things, like the influence of ownership, wouldn't be all that different just because it's a different platform. But there might be other things that would be different. And it seems to me one of those might be the advertising models. And I didn't see really any discussion, which I think is a really important point, about how advertising is becoming much more targeted. And it's a different, we're going from a model where advertising was traditionally separate from programming, and now it's also much more integrated into programming. So that's an area I'd be interested to hear more about. I guess my final point is that it seems to me your most important conclusions are there really isn't very much research on a lot of important questions, and even the research that doesn't exist is not necessarily that helpful for policymakers. So of course, I know we'd all love to see more research, but do you have any ideas about how this can happen? Because I think a lot of times this research is very expensive, and especially like when I'm thinking about people with disabilities, there's lots of research I'd love to see done there, but it's not something that you can easily get funding to do. I think funding is a big problem here. So if you have any ideas about that, I'd like to hear them.
Maybe we'll go this way. Okay. Let me address the last issue, if I may, about the work that the scholarly community can do to help decision makers, and also the cost to decision makers of having to hire people to do that, either letting contracts or hiring new people within their own organization. And in a period of scarce resources, I think we're all very sensitive to that. And I think we just have to say up front that creating these new methodologies, combining them, will take time, effort, work, and money. And it is probably the case that doing the kind of work that we recommend will be marginally more difficult and marginally more expensive for all the reasons that I suspect everybody in this room is aware of, especially doing case studies and aggregating up from case studies rather than down from large N kind of data collections. But we come back to the fact that the law says certain kinds of issues need to be addressed. And we believe that in the absence of the kind of research that we're calling for, the Federal Communications Commissions and other federal bodies will be unable to meet their mandate. They will be unable to meet the mandate. It's, again, sort of so it is a cost, and we recognize that. Now, clearly, there's a gray area. Some things will be too expensive and complicated to do in a perfect world. I mean, in a perfect world, you wouldn't have to worry about that, but it's an imperfect world. But I think our position as scholars is that in the same way that NASA has to spend money on certain kinds of research, and Homeland Security has to spend money on certain kinds of research, that in a communications and information economy and society, those federal institutions that have responsibility in that domain also have to find ways to generate the answers that they need to be able to make effective decisions. So we recognize that, but we think other agencies have found ways to do it, and we're confident that agencies with responsibility in this space could do that as well. Carola, you want to make a point?
If I can just add on to that, we know, in fact, from other conversations we've had that there are other agencies that are interested in these kinds of questions, and so there may be some terrific opportunities for interagency collaboration, God forbid, but that we certainly see those trends in many areas of disaster response already, and so why not extend those kinds of collaborative arrangements and co-financing opportunities to the information space. And what we also know is that many organizations who might be interested in funding, whether they are public or private organizations, in supporting this kind of research, look to agencies such as the FCC for leadership on these issues. Because one of the things that we found in conducting this research was when we said this wasn't just a bunch of scholars from the University of Southern California and the University of Delaware and the University of Wisconsin pulling this information together, but that we were in fact doing so at the behest of the Commission, it gave us a leg up. It made it possible to bring together this kind of knowledge, and so I would also not underestimate the political leverage and even the intellectual credibility that comes with having the highest leadership supporting this work and embracing it.
Katya?
So just very quickly on the first question, I think this is a great example of what Phil was actually talking about. Should we be concerned with information availability, or should we also be looking at information consumption? And we also can look at this in the context of different social groups, because we know, as you say, that 50% of the population uses or doesn't use cable, but we can also see within those 50% that there will be different socioeconomic groups and different ethnic groups and so on and so forth that will have different patterns of media use. And so this is one question as to how much we should be concerned about this. And also, do we really care about what format the information comes with? Do we want it to come in multiple formats, or just one is enough, and so on? And I also just wanted to mention something that I forgot before. It refers to the Creative Commons question. We actually did have in the bibliography and the lit review that we put together a whole section on open access and knowledge commons. And we think this is a very, very important issue. And so we wanted also to thank Charlotte Hess, who helped us put together this part of the literature, and we may expand on this in the future.
I don't know if I would paint the conclusions of this with quite as broad a brush as you did. I think the issue is that really we're looking at a media environment that is different now than even 5 years ago. So the fact that the ideal template for research going forward, or the answers to all of the relevant questions now weren't located is inevitable. But what I hope, my approach to this was that I would hope that within this are a bunch of different seeds and a bunch of obvious and sort of potentially appealing methodological approaches to pull from and potentially integrate, because I think within there, and that's one thing we're not be able to do in this presentation, is to sit there and talk about, we thought this particular study has real value here, and this particular study informs this and can be useful in A, B, and C ways. We're not getting obviously into that level of specificity, but I think each of us off the top of our heads could probably point to 2 or 3 or 4 studies that we looked at as very useful in informing our understanding of what is happening now, but also as useful guideposts for research that can be scaled up to really meaningfully inform policy. Because as you point out, what you often see that are these sort of, because of the funding issues, I have this idea for a study, but I can really only do it on this town, on this issue, maybe just studying this platform, and then we see a bunch of those, and there's a lot of units of analysis that are scattered across all these different types of studies that ideally get pulled together in a more holistic way. So I think, for example, of the Baltimore study that probably a lot of people here are very familiar with, how news happens in one community. I think there's rich opportunities within a particular study like that to think about how that could be scaled up methodologically in ways, for example, that draw upon some of the more computer-assisted data gathering techniques that could be used as a template for annual systematic data gathering and analysis of the health of a sample of local media ecosystems. So I wouldn't want to sort of allow the characterization to go forward that we didn't really find anything useful in our 80 pages of stuff that we reviewed. That isn't the case at all.
Yeah, first of all, I want to just acknowledge Mr. Rubino's question was lost, our point lost in the shuffle here maybe a little bit. That's very interesting, both concept and interesting data. And of course, I haven't seen the data, so I'm not going to speak to your figures. But even to the extent that there is an underrepresentation of cable penetration, we do know that minority and lower income households rely on over-the-air broadcasting more than higher income and majority households. So even if there is, whatever the gap there might be, we know there is a gap. And to the extent that there is a gap in the provision of PEG channels versus over-the-air broadcasting civic information, that's a very interesting point and something that bluntly I hadn't thought about and we probably should look at more carefully.
Not just the minority communities. Now that we're cutting and shaving a cable, you're seeing all demographic groups.
Oh, sure. Right. Absolutely. No, but I'm saying we know definitively that in lower income communities there's a higher, and among seniors there's a higher use of over-the-air broadcasting. So that's just one thing that we do know, but you're right, it extends. A lot of middle class people are, in hard times cutting their cable and so on. To Professor Campbell's question, how we chose these categories, I was waiting for that question. I figured it would come up. We use the word vague. It cut me to the quick, I have to say. We did use I'm happy to get into the method as much as you want me to. I'm sure most people here don't want me to get into it too much, but basically we did systematically sit down and look at a range of literature. We tried to, this goes to questions that have been raised about content throughout this discussion. Bluntly, we had 2 months to do this. We had to draw some lines someplace. We were not primarily dealing, for example, with representation. So representations, we did ask for some contributions from scholars. Actually, they didn't necessarily come in. So we couldn't get into questions of representation. We couldn't get into questions of advertising. We just bluntly drew the line there. And our mandate, as Professor Wilson said earlier, was to talk, and Napoli as well, was to talk about critical information needs of communities regardless of whether they were being provided or not. So we work within that framework. We sat down, first of all, we inductively looked at literature. I mean, I've been working on these problems for, more years than my gray hair suggests. And we said, what are these basic needs? What are the things that every citizen would need to have? And they would certainly need health information. They would certainly need educational information. They would need disaster information and so on. And we went through we scaled it from what we saw as the most sort of absolutely critical. People need disaster and risk information in real time in ways they can understand, to those areas that were more, if you will, abstract, like political information, but were core to the very idea of a local democracy. You can't have a local democracy if you don't know who your candidates are. So we tried to go through these areas, induce the 8 areas that we had. Now, boy, we could sit here pretty much all day, and I actually would like to. That's how strange I am. I'd like, and discuss why these categories and others. So you brought up children. We did largely subsume children under education. There's a range of family needs, a range of women's needs. Boy, we could have expanded these categories, and bluntly, parsimony and an extraordinary time constraint forced us to pare these down to what we saw as a set of bare essentials. Now, as we know, human needs, community needs, individuals' needs are broad. They proliferate. You could certainly argue that not these 8 categories, another 8, not these 8, another 10 or 15. And I'm certainly not going to argue that, boy, these were the only 8 categories one could imagine. But we do think that we captured a set of bedrock needs and bedrock areas that any individual and any community would need to function. And so that was the criteria that we used, and we really did apply strict criteria of parsimony. I can't say it, but we did apply the criteria. We tried to make sure that that every need that we included could relatively, without great argument, be included in a list of community information needs, even though we know that there are any number of imaginable other needs that we might have included.
Just a quick note on that, and I think we're going to take 1 or 2 more, is that we debated the same question. Running through the analysis, you will see that, and this is something that Lou really helped us with, sort of the critical needs of information needs of communities at sort of the meso level, if you will, but we also bounce that against the critical needs of individuals to be able to effectively operate, as Phil was saying earlier, to be able to make the choices that they need to make. And this is something that Professor Park talked about. So I think we would actually certainly welcome, either today or through emails or through other ways of being in touch with us, your views of that balance between the critical information needs of communities and the critical information needs of individuals. And when you read the report in detail, you will see that both of those come up, and we treat them slightly differently in a complementary way. But I think we would welcome any sort of methodological or substantive comments about ways of integrating the community information needs and the individual information needs in ways that are more effective than we were able to do in our short time. Why don't we take a couple of more? Yes, Carol.
One other thing to think about is, we can add categories infinitely, but one of our mandates was to come up with the beginnings of a template for how do we even think about categories of critical information needs. And so ideally what one would come up with is a methodology or a metric that allows you to apply that to any number of categories that could grow. I mean, there may be new categories that we don't even know about yet. So if we limit ourselves only to the ones that we can think of and that we can justify through systematic social scientific methods, we may in fact artificially be limiting which critical information needs we should take into account.
But a perfect case where we have 8, do we need 12? Do we need 15? I suspect that our friends at the FCC would say, don't give me 15 categories. If anything, take those 8 and reduce them to some more manageable thing. That would be. So I think, sort of the tension between completeness and coverage and the utility of an intellectual tool that can actually be employed effectively, I think, is a balance we have to strike.
Specifically to that point,
yes, sir.
in our business planning, what we did was we took all government agencies, use that on the left-hand column.
And we took government information that was being put out to citizens, and then we mapped that against what citizens or consumers were looking for. It's important that all that government agency information get to people. Right now, in the last 20 years, it's sitting in these vast silos of e-government content, and people don't have access to it. If 30% of the people don't have broadband, they don't have access to that information. Libraries are overfilled. You've got to get content out and then get needs in. That's the way we looked at it.
And that's relatively cheap. The data's already there. But again, we don't know the information about the information. Other comments or questions?
Hi, Corey Wright from Free Press. I just wanted to thank the panel. It was a very ambitious undertaking in a relatively short period of time. My own organization has strenuously urged the FCC to engage in this kind of research, and I would reiterate that it seems like there's further research that needs to be done, and I would second Dean Wilson's point that this is necessary, not just for the FCC's fulfillment of the statutory mandate, but also a court remand regarding the FCC's media ownership rules, which ask the FCC to look at barriers to entry of broadcast ownership for women and people of color. But I actually wanted to direct my comment to, I think, the continuum of compelling information interests that the study identifies. On one hand, you have basic emergency information critical to, saving life and limb. And on the other hand, you have political information, which I think is necessary for engagement in exercising sort of the highest level of power and civic engagement, which is your vote. I'm aware of some research that looks at the connection between ownership of outlets, specifically broadcast outlets, by underrepresented groups, Spanish speakers and African Americans, in a correlation to voter turnout among those groups. And I think that the research that you summarized touches upon that, but I wanted to get a better sense from your review of the literature, since this is such an important part of civic engagement, if you think that the correlation between ownership of an outlet and civic engagement by the groups that are targeted by that is well established, or whether more research needs to be done. Thank you.
Yeah. Why don't both of you all address that?
First, those studies are in there. We found those, and that was a case where, as much as, that might be an issue that sort of stretched the bounds of the questions we were asked to look at, that literature is so important in that it really does look at the process from production to consumption to political participation, and really does represent as holistic and a research approach, I think, to these, to the type of broader issues that this whole project is motivated by, as you could find out there. We've seen it also not only within the context of minority groups, but also within the context of local versus national news and information. That is the extent to which news imported from outside of a community, the extent to which that information is consumed, can in of itself depress participation in local elections. So actually, so that body of literature we did incorporate into this analysis. And again, I think as far as whether more work in that vein is necessary, I think that again it sort of goes to that key question, which is how do we define the range of these concerns going forward? I think it becomes a very useful measure, sort of a very valuable dependent variable in terms of operationalizing how and the extent to which community information needs are being met, or do we see them translate into various types of forms of community participation, political participation, maybe even political knowledge. It opens another, I think, very valuable can of worms. But but certainly makes this a bigger set of research projects going forward. But certainly ones that would be incredibly informative and useful.
Yeah, I would just say we found many valuable cans of worms in the course of this literature review, but that's essential work. And I think that while, there's extensive research in political science, we touched on some of it, we know about others, but the relationship between ownership and political voting behavior is fairly sparse. I think that it's clearly correlational literature, and it's weak. But having said that, or precisely because that's the case, it's critical, because essentially the most essential right in a democracy is the right to vote. And if there are clear links between the form in which information is provided and the ownership structure within information is provided and turnout of differential groups, we need to know more about that. And while there's some literature on African American communities, although that's not as strong in terms of voting behavior as it really probably could be. Probably the better literature is actually on Latino broadcast ownership, because it's sort of a clear independent variable. Essentially, is there Spanish language information available, and if so, is that mobilizing of turnout? And the short answer is, as you might expect, yes, there is, but only under certain circumstances. And so ownership does matter, because if a station is not including robust local news in its Spanish language ownership, then not surprisingly, the turnout effect is likely to be lower. Now, we don't know as much about that as we should, but that absolutely needs to be part of the future research agenda.
With that, we're slipping a little bit past the noon hour. Again, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of you for coming, for your participation. I'd like to thank Dean Wilson and all of our panelists for the tremendous amount of work that they've put in. Of course, obviously, the USC Annenberg Group for pulling together this report in such a short period of time, how comprehensive it is, and how valuable it is to our continuing work. And also Professors Park and Ladd and Hamilton for quickly digesting what is, even though it's a preliminary piece of work, a very detailed piece of work, and being able to come back with such insightful comments for us and for this debate. So with that, I'm going to close us out. Again, thanks all, and have a great day.